parenting is a life. It's not a formula. The big test that we're preparing our kids for is not their 6th grade algebra test. It is that day they stand before Almighty God. Everything you need to be as a parent, the Holy Spirit is. Raising children isn't easy. Don't do it alone. Okay, welcome to our third session on parenting. Our subject is preteens, and this is ages 7 to 12. I would say ages 7 to 12, 8 to 12. There's this preteen period in their life where they're no longer a toddler, and they are just like sponges, and they can understand things, and this is a period in their life, where I might say the key word for teens is grace. The key word for preteens is train. Train. This is the time where you inculcate them in the laws of God, okay? You train their consciences. Listen, kids aren't born with consciences knowing right from wrong. If you grow up in a family that thinks cannibalism, is okay, your conscience thinks cannibalism is okay. I mean, that's how drastic it can be. Your conscience is trained by your environment. And this is where it's our responsibility to train the conscience of our kids, what's right and wrong. Key verse here, Ephesians 6:4. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And here's the balance again, okay? Boy, we're going to train our kids in right and wrong. We're going to have high standards. But we're going to try to make sure that we're not expecting more than we should of our kids. And I know that's about, you don't want to exasperate them. I see two things here. Fathers, don't exasperate them. Don't have expectations beyond what they're able to do. But at the same time, wow, here's a challenge. Bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. I mean, the training and instruction of the Lord is challenging for us, let alone a 10-year-old. And the training and instruction of the Lord for our kids. Can I have one of those 10 rules? This is what I'm talking about. This is how I have summarized for our family the training and instruction of the Lord. This is my expectations. I think an 8, 9, 10-year-old can do this, and they can learn this. This is not expecting too much. This is not exasperating them. And I think this is the standard right here. And but let me talk for a minute here about the 4 general seasons of parenting. In ages 2 through 6, the toddler age, the key thing is respecting the parent, okay? That's what you're trying to get in that kid's life, respect for the parent. And you're establishing yourself as the authority in the kid's life. And by the way, if you don't accomplish these goals in each stage of the kid's life, every stage is going to be different. This is why the teenage years are so horrible if you haven't gained authority in their life when they were little. Teens will just be that much harder. So that's the goal of the toddler age is gaining that goal in their life. And the challenges during those toddler years are you're probably newly married, so there can be some marital problems there going on, and just learning how to serve one another in your marriage. But you need to gain the respect of your kids in that stage. The second stage is this 6 to 11 to 12-year age. And the goal there is loving the parent, that the kid loves the parent. And again, I'm not talking about being buddy-buddy. I'm talking about how did Jesus define love for him? He says, if you love me, you will what? You will obey me. So that's how he spelled love at this stage of child raising. It's not L-O-V-E, but O-B-E-Y. And as my friend John Hopper I've heard him say, O and K comes before Y. When you're raising kids at this age, OK comes before Y. He's talking about the alphabet, of course, in one sense. The letters O and K come before the letter Y. But when we're raising kids at this stage in their lives, OK comes before Y. Do you want me to do this? Now, when they're teens, that's a little bit different. But at this stage, you're looking for obedience. And it's establishing, at this stage, these preteens, it's establishing and educating and enforcing family rules, the training instruction of the Lord. These kids at this age are like sponges. boy, this is the most impressionable time of their year, in my opinion, of their lives right now. Between those ages, between 6, 7, and 12, that's the most impressionable time of their life. And that's why we're training. That's why we're trying to be consistent in these rules. Now, don't forget, even though I tell you that the one word, if you want one word for the goal of this stage of their life is training, don't forget fun, okay? Don't forget that. Don't forget hugs. Don't forget laughing. Don't forget having fun. Because you want that relationship with them. I don't want you to miss that. You want that friendship with them. I'd say that relationship with them, that they enjoy being around you. But training is a key here. Proverbs 22 is a principle, a very important principle. It's not a promise, but it is a principle. Train up a child in the way he should go when he's, especially at this age right here. That's what age this is talking about. That word child isn't talking about infants or toddlers. It's not talking about young adults. It's talking about children, this very age. That's the Hebrew word there. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, because they are so impressionable at this age. Ages 12 through 18, those teen years, the goal is imitating the parent. That's what you want to be doing. You want to be imitating the parent. As you're releasing them and they're going on to life, the goal is that they're following God. So those are different seasons, and I wanted to just share that briefly with you so you know what context we're in here. This session's on that place where we're training these kids. I've already talked about grace and truth, and I'm not sure why I've got this in this outline here. I'll just talk about it some more. There is still, even at this stage, a need for grace and truth. This is what Jesus came full of. This is who he was, grace and truth. The Bible tells us that. What's the opposites of grace and truth? Well, the opposite of grace is anger, okay? The opposite of truth, that you're imposing God's expectations on these children, the opposite of that is passivity. You don't want to be passive. You got to be active here. You got to be on top of things, and you can't be angry. Anger never accomplishes the righteousness of God, never. And love will be your guide. What's the most loving thing here? To have grace right now, or to lay down the law? Love will be your guide in that. I already talked about how God is raising his child, you, while you are raising his children. And our children's needs often relate to a need in our own life. God is training us. Boy, you will see that. Don't be frustrated with that. A need in your parenting. God's trying to help you learn something as well. Trying to help you learn grace. He wants to remind you of how gracious he's been to you, so that you will treat your kids with more grace. You'll treat his kids with more grace. That's something he wants you to grow up in. This stage, obviously every stage of parenting, anger is just incredibly destructive. You just cannot allow anger. And you've got to watch over your anger with your kids. James 1:19, you need to memorize as a parent. And again, this is, here's an area where, as you're raising your kids, God's raising you, okay? He doesn't want you, his kid, to be, struggling with anger. And he doesn't want you raising your kids with anger. And this is probably the most common and destructive thing we do. And I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad here. I think especially of our moms. I'm telling you, if I had to be with all my kids 8 hours a day, all day long, I'd be tested in anger too. And moms, I'm not trying to come down on you here. This is not easy. What tests our ability to remain in the Spirit of God more than, being surrounded with little kids? Nothing. I'm telling you, it's a whole lot easier for me to be in the Spirit at my job than it is for my stay-at-home wife to be in the Spirit at her job. I can tell you that right now. I'm dealing with adults. My wife's dealing constantly with little kids at home. And so I'm not trying to come down on moms because I can't imagine how difficult that can be some days. But I'm just telling you what God says about anger. He doesn't want it. And it's destructive and it hurts our kids. James 1:19, my dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. You got to underline that. You got to memorize that, because maybe you don't believe that. that last part. Man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. You see, you think if you raise your voice, if you get angry, it's going to teach your kids something good. God's telling you right here. A man's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. That's not the result of us speaking to our kids in anger. It doesn't encourage righteousness. It pulls them away from you. It makes them afraid of you. It brings shame and guilt. It separates them from you. That's what the anger does. They don't learn anything in that, except that, gee, I can't trust my mom or my dad. I'm not sure when they're going to blow up. I can't trust them. And that's what it teaches them. This is why the devil is just constantly working in your life to make you angry, because he knows how destructive it is. He hates your family. He hates your kids. He hates your marriage. And one of his greatest tools is anger, to destroy all of those things: your marriage, your kids, your life. Anger. I talked in my first session about the importance of getting these footholds out of our life. And Ephesians 4:26 talks about this, that something happens in your life, you don't forgive it. It can be 25 years ago, and this foothold of the devil gets in your life, this foothold of bitterness. And believe me, it will come out in your other relationships. You got to deal with that stuff. I said before, parenting's a little bit like that Hippocratic oath that doctors take. Do no harm. If you're going to do nothing else, at least don't do harm. And anger does harm. Anger does harm. Anger is like a doctor, cutting up a patient for no reason at all. It doesn't help them. And now you've got something that has to heal. There is a time to cut with love and truth, but anger, that's not anger. Anger is not it. So you got to be careful with that baggage that you have in your life. And again, this is why I'm saying, as we're raising our kids, God's raising us. And it's our marriages and our parenting that brings that stuff to the surface. Say, you know what? I struggle too much with this. I need to get some help. We talked about that in the first session. We talk about that a lot in our church. Listen to some of those messages that I've given. I've recommended that you just look at the sermon archives. We talk a lot about that at New Life, those types of issues. Walking in the Spirit and having that control over those things like worry and anger. We talk a lot about that because it's so important. All right. It's important to establish, educate, and enforce specific rules for your family. Kids got to know what you're expecting. You need to establish. This is how we can exasperate our children at this stage, is there's no clear boundaries. We're not sure what mom and dad expect, and they're kind of inconsistent about it. Now, this is so very important. One of the reasons I came up with 10 rules is because I think you need to be careful of having 11, 12, 15, 20, 25. Be careful about being the Pharisees. What did they have? Something like 430 laws? Okay. Got 10 that pretty much cover everything that a 6 to 12-year-old needs to be doing. And that's kind of what the 10 Commandments were about. God wanted to summarize things. Now, I think there's several hundred laws in the Old Testament as well. But God summarized them. And in fact, Jesus did this for us in the New Testament. He summarized them down to 2. And this is what we need as children of God, and this is what our kids need. Look, kid, love God first, put Him first, and love other people. That's what I want you to do. And so be simple here in this stage, because life gets complicated later on, but you got to make life simple for these younger kids at this point in time. And when they do something, that's out of line, I'll bet you that 99% of the time you can point to one of these 10 rules and say, which one of these did you just violate, son? And I bet you it'll fit on one of these. And you can just show them, this is the law. We need the law in our life. God has the law in our life for a purpose to lead us in righteousness. So we need to establish these rules. Now, you can take the rules that we've had for our family. You can come up with your own, by the way. This isn't necessarily the only thing the Bible has to say. I've just tried to summarize what I have expected of my kids at this age, and to help them. I mean, this goes right on our refrigerator, and helps us. We could use, you could use the Ten Commandments right out of the Bible, by the way. I'll just never forget, we were having a VBS class, and Levi Herr was about, I don't know, he was 6 or 7 years old, and I was interviewing all the kids that were going through VBS class, and the topic that summer for VBS was the Ten Commandments. And I was asking each kid, so what was the 10th commandment that most impressed you, that you want to, specifically strive to follow? And Levi Herr did not hesitate. He looked at me and says, you shall not commit adultery. 7 years old. And I just got a kick out of that. Didn't even know what adultery was. But, you can come up with your own rules. Take them from the Bible, of course, but this is our 10 commandments for our home, for our kids. You need to educate. And again, educating is not about family devotions. I get a little concerned when I read these books on parenting. They try to make it a formula. Parenting is a life. It's not a formula. Again, the statistics tell us that the formula is failing. The formula is, well, make sure you go to church, make sure your kids are in Sunday school, make sure they're in a youth group with a youth pastor, make sure you have family devotions. I'm going to tell you right now, probably my greatest failing as a dad is the lack of family devotions that we've had, where I'm actually sitting my kids down in the living room at night before bed, and we're talking about the Bible and praying together. I'm just going to tell you right now, I don't think that's been good. That's my greatest failing as a dad, is not being consistent enough with family devotions. I mean, some of the times it's because we're serving, till later at night, and by the time we're done, it's time to go to bed. I mean, sometimes that's the case. A lot of times it's just, I'm tired. There's no excuse. But the reason I share that with you is I think sometimes we've idolized family devotions as, okay, if you do that one thing, you're going to turn out good kids. I'm not trying to make excuses for my failing here. I'm just saying the reason I've raised good kids is because of my life. You can't make up for a lack of life and what you're doing with your life with a 20-minute family devotional. And don't make parenting a program and a bunch of, a set of rules and stuff. Now, I'm going to be misunderstood here. I hope you do better at family devotions than I have, okay? It's a great thing for your kids. I so respect Pastor Pete for that. He's been much more faithful with that than I have been. But again, the reason I share is because be careful of what's, don't strain a gnat and swallow a camel here. The camel is how you're living your life. Are you walking in the Spirit of God? That's the camel. And that's the camel. And that's how the Old Testament describes how we're to teach our kids. It's not in classrooms that our kids are to learn God's commandments. It's in life. Deuteronomy chapter 6, these commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. They got to be your life upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. How? Well, talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the door frames of your houses, on your gates. I mean, this is their whole life. This is their whole life. And it's a lifestyle of engaging our kids with the rules of God. And this is where enforcement comes in. This is how our kids are going to learn. They're going to learn when they disobey those rules and they're talked to about it or they're disciplined for it. That's how they're going to learn. And you got to establish these rules. You've got to educate them on these rules, and you got to enforce them. And Proverbs 3:12, the Lord disciplines those He loves as a father the son He delights in. And we got to be willing to. One thing I want to say about this age, 6 to 11 to 12 or so, it is more important to be their boss than their buddy. We're still in that stage where I'm not saying you can't be their buddy. I'm just saying it's more important to be their boss than their buddy. And sometimes, you'll see a dad who feels so guilty about how little time he spends with his kids, how busy he is at work. He feels so guilty that he so much tries to be the buddy of his kid and give him a bunch of stuff and try to be his buddy. It hurts his kid. It hurts his kid to do that. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of parents that struggle with their own self-esteem that's really, really hard for the kids not to like them. Because their self-esteem in Christ is lacking, they need approval from their kids. And so they'll be too lenient with them, trying to be their buddy instead of their boss at this stage of life. Your kids need you to be their boss more than their buddy at this stage. And I know that sounds like I'm totally changing things here, what I said about teens, am I? You got to catch that. There's a difference between this stage of life and being a teen. Right now, it's more law than grace, relatively speaking. I'm not saying that when you correct them, you have to do it with a smile. I mean that. When you're talking to your kids and you're enforcing things, do it with a smile. That's speaking the truth in love. Son, what did you just do there? What rule did you violate? And you got a smile on your face, okay? Because you love them. So, son, there needs to be some consequences for that because you keep doing that. I want to help you learn this. And you're being a nice boss, okay? You're not being their buddy. You're being a nice boss. That's what you need to be. And again, Paul tells us not to exasperate our children. The way we'll exasperate them is not being consistent with these rules. We got to be consistent with them, and that can be a challenge. So let me just briefly go through these rules for our family. And boy, if you can, what you're going to notice about particularly the beginning part of these rules is they are God-centered. You see, by ages 6 and on, it's not so much any. When they're 3, 4, and 5, it's about obeying dad and mom. Mom and dad are God. I don't even know if there's a God when I'm 3 years old. Maybe I do. But especially as they get older, 6 through 12, you need to start pointing them towards God. Son, you didn't disobey me, you disobeyed your Father in heaven. And that's why rule number 1 is to love God, not love me. Love God. This is about loving God, son, daughter. These are His rules. I didn't make up these rules, son. These rules, I can show you right in the Bible, where your Creator, your God, these are His rules. And at this point in time, you got to start pointing them towards God. And so the first rule is to love God. And, this is where you start having them get into the Bible. And they're writing down a verse. And they're interacting with God through the Scriptures. That's one way we love God. And it's just a precious thing to see a kid sing to God, see a kid pray to God, that they're starting to get this relationship with God. They understand that this Bible is the Word of God, and they're interacting with it. And they can start doing that at a very early age. And it's a wonderful thing to see when they start interacting with God. You want to start that as early as possible. It's not just you. Secondly, honor your parents. Incredibly important. Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and they may enjoy a long life on earth. The reason I'm telling you that you need to be your kids' boss instead of their buddy, the reason I'm telling you is that you need to establish your authority in their life is for their sake. This is the most loving thing you can do. If they don't learn how to respect their parents, their life will be miserable. That's why there's a promise here that if a kid will learn how to honor their father and mother, that their life will go well. And learning how to respect authority. Think about a kid. I mean, this was me, okay? I grew up not respecting authority. I didn't like my teachers. I was constantly in trouble in school. And then I did a really dumb thing. I joined the military. And you talk about my pride and the drill sergeant's, bam! It was hard. It was hard being in the military and being a young man that did not respect authority. And I am so thankful that the military taught me to respect authority. I didn't learn that growing up. I wish I would have. I didn't learn it. But I learned it in the military, and it has served me well to learn that, to respect the God-given authorities in my life. Because imagine a young man or a girl that doesn't respect authority. I mean, they're the worst kids you can imagine. You talk to a middle school public school teacher, a high school teacher who's in those schools. I mean, what is their biggest problem? Those kids don't respect them. They don't respect. I mean, you just be absolutely amazed because these kids know now that these teachers can't touch them. I had a middle school teacher tell me a few weeks ago that this group of 2 or 3 kids, I can't remember what they did, but they did something right in front of this teacher and they looked at him and they did it purposely right in front of him. Just to be in your face, you can't touch me. And this was a middle school kid. No respect for authority at all. Don't you dare let your kids grow up that way. You make sure that they respect mom and dad. And I'll tell you, yes, you want them to love you, but there'll be times where it's just, gee, I'm going to obey. And there's some fear involved here, okay? Some healthy fear that I'm going to obey. And they may not love you on that day, but doggone it, they're going to respect you. And some days are going to be like that. And you don't want that to continue all the way through to where you release them as an 18-year-old, where they're just conforming. But you definitely have to establish that at this age, that they are conforming and they are obeying and they are respecting. And that word honor in the Greek just means to treat with respect and reverence, that they reverence you. And they reverence you because of the consequences. A 7-year-old isn't a real good judge of character. They're not respecting you because, wow, Dad's such a quality guy. It's because there's consequences. It's because they do want to please you, too. That's part of it. God's built that into them. Use that. Use that. Another thing is just awe. There's nothing better than a youngster to think that their parent is the best person in the world, to be proud of their parents. And you want to be cultivating that as well. And, of course, we know whether or not they're respecting us by, are they heeding our voice when we have something to say? Are they listening? Are they obeying? That's the test. That's how they're honoring your parents. Do they obey when we speak? Honor others. And by the way, again, we got to remember grace here. I don't obey God perfectly. I don't obey every time God tells me to do something. All right? So there's grace here. But there are consequences every time I disobey God. His commandments are there for our good. And whenever I don't obey them, it's going to hurt my life somehow. And so there's still grace here. But I am encouraged us not to be passive, wimpy parents at this stage. I just met with a family here a couple weeks ago. They had a little kid who was running the family. Dad wasn't boss, mom wasn't boss. This little kid was the boss. And he knew it. And they were miserable. And so Brenda and I sat down with them, told them some of the things we're telling you today. And just yesterday, they told me our family is completely different. We're in charge now. And that little boy is such a greater joy to us than he was. And you can't be wimps. You got to be tough. This is where dads come in. Saying, hey, there's just been oftentimes, again, I know I sound contradictory because when my kids are older, I'm a pushover. I don't want to use that word. I'm just very gracious, okay? But when they're younger, when they're in their preteens, I'm firm. And sometimes Brenda has struggled with that. Sometimes maybe she's thought I'm being too hard on those younger kids. And especially in my last session when we talk about disciplining little kids, spanking them. And there's been some times where my wife wondered, are you being too hard here? And then at other times, and by the way, sometimes she's right. I'm not trying to say, she's always been wrong. Sometimes she's been right. But then in the older ages, sometimes Brenda struggled with, am I being too lenient? And am I giving too much freedom? And, I just want to say, trust the Spirit-filled dad. I don't say that again to demean women in any way. But I just think God put dads in the family to be that source of the law and the grace. And trust the Spirit-filled dad. Now, if dad's angry and a jerk and all that type of thing, okay, well, then you got problems. But if dad's being humble and he's Spirit-filled, trust him on when there needs to be law and when there needs to be grace. Because I think oftentimes women will struggle with that. They'll think, you should have been stronger here and you should have been weaker here. The buck stops with dad anyway. The buck stops with dad. And let him lead in that balance between grace and truth. All right, rule number 4, tell the truth. You're going to be surprised with this one, and you're going to be, I don't know if my kids could do anything that would disappoint me more than lie to me, okay? This one just really hurts because it just breaks that relationship. I want a relationship with you, kid, and if you're going to lie to me, we can't have a relationship. And this is a hard one, and this is one is hard for me to not just really ramp up the law here, okay, and be hard. Now, we haven't had much of a problem, thank God, with our kids being dishonest. I think one of the reasons for that is, again, because of the atmosphere of grace. We try to create a family culture where it's okay to admit you did wrong. Now, it's not because there's never any consequences. It's just because, I'm not going to lose my relationship with my parents. They're not going to get ticked off at me. There's not going to be, an angry sermon here. That there's an atmosphere of grace, and our kids feel like they can be honest with us. In a family of anger, it's a whole lot harder for our kids to be honest. And so for a family of grace, it helps that honesty thing, to tell the truth. I'm sorry, I skipped number 3. Honor others. Where this comes in, obviously, it comes in how they treat their siblings. And this is incredibly important that you're enforcing love between your kids. And you'll see challenges in that area. Now, Brenda and I are just pleased as punch that our older girls have grown up to be best friends. That hasn't always been the case. And I'll tell you that right now. Their personalities have clashed like anything you can imagine sometimes. I talked earlier about Jessica's messiness. That was as hard on some of her sisters as it was on Mom. And we needed to help our girls treat one another with grace. The twins, I don't know. There's just something supernatural going on there. These guys, they hardly ever fight. They just love each other. And I don't know if we're ever going to be able to separate them. I hope so at some point in time. If they get married, they better live separately geographically because their wives are going to be pretty envious of the relationship these two boys have. But respecting siblings is something you have to expect, and respecting other adults is part of that as well. Honoring others. Watch out for that. Very important for these kids to learn how to respect others as well. You can train them in that. Number 5, do not hurt others. Pretty self-explanatory, but that certainly happens. And that's a rule that you can point to often. One of your kids gets selfish, they take something. Okay, son, rule number 5, do not hurt others. Did you hurt your brother there? And it's right there. That'll cover a lot of ground. Forgive others when they hurt you. This is so incredibly important to teach our kids how to forgive. And they can. Imagine a young boy or girl who grows up not knowing how to forgive people. They are going to be in deep, deep trouble because they are going to be sinned against their whole life. And quite frankly, hardly anybody's going to sin against them more than their siblings. You got, an 8-year-old boy and a 10-year-old boy. I mean, there's going to be a lot of sin there. And if they do not learn how to reconcile a relationship after there's been sin, if they don't learn the power that it talks about in Scripture, that love covers a multitude of sin, they're going to be in deep trouble. And at this age, they can learn this. They can learn how to forgive. They can learn how to let something go. Because God has forgiven them and you have forgiven them. And I've had that talk with my kids before. Son, do I treat you with grace? Yep. I'm asking you to treat them with grace. They get it. Have they experienced grace in their life? Have they experienced you forgiving them and God forgiving them so that they can forgive others? Another reason to treat them with grace sometimes is to train them in that forgiveness. What's neat about this is that really forgiveness for these little kids is easier than for us adults. I don't know what that's about them. This is relatively easy. It's a little bit like, how easy it is for kids to learn a foreign language? It's easy to train our kids in some of these things. It's easier if you train them here at this stage in their life to forgive people than having to train them later. It's hard for adults to learn how to forgive. If you haven't learned that, it's much harder to learn that. So take advantage of that. One of the things I talk about with my kids is don't let someone else's sin become your sin. Don't let someone else's sin become your sin. Now, how valuable would that be if we learned that as parents? That if someone does something bad to us, we don't do something bad, like get angry, like want revenge. Don't let someone else's sin make you sin. I'm trying to help our kids understand that. Rule 7, share what you have. 1 Timothy 6:18, be generous and willing to share. This is so good for our kids because they've got that sinful nature in them just like we do. And it's all about me. And the default mode for our kids will be to grow up selfish. And we've really got to help them with this one. And this starts very early with being willing to share and learning the joy of giving. Jesus said, it's more blessed, it's more happy. That's what that word means, to be blessed. It means to be happy. You're more happy when you're giving than receiving. And to help them experience that joy of giving is just so very important. And especially, obviously, with their siblings and whatnot. But now, let me say something about this. Make sure that they have ownership of something before you're asking them to give it. That toy you want them to share, make sure that everybody understands, this is his toy. I gave it to him. Don't have this stuff where, it's kind of communism, where everything is everybody's. Let them have some ownership of something. This is my toy. This is my football. Dad gave it to me for Christmas. Let them have some ownership of they need ownership of a space in the house. This is my bed. This isn't communism. Because giving is only meaningful when it's yours to give. That's when it's meaningful. So even at a young age, help your kids understand, son, this is yours to give or to keep. It's yours. Help them have some ownership first before they freely give. Part of this is, again, they need some identity. It just helps them to have some ownership of something before they give it. Rule 8, care for what you have. Again, helping our kids, they have ownership of some things, and having them take responsibility for those things is very important. They can learn this. This is an expectation that you can have of these kids, is that they take care of what they have. 1 Corinthians 4:2, the New Century Version, those who are trusted with something valuable must show they are worthy of that trust. Teaching this thing. Give them things to take care of. And this helps them understand everything we have is from God. And because it's from God, it is valuable. Why is this thing valuable? Because it's from God. And that's why you need to take care of it. And kids don't take care of their stuff because they don't think it is valuable. And maybe they have to do without it for a while to learn that it's valuable. Don't let kids take things for granted. That's one of the greatest, most common sins that we commit against God is we take everything for granted. And we don't value the stuff we have. We don't take stock of how generous God has been to us. And so we don't value the stuff very much. Don't let our kids do that. Help them to value stuff. And it gets harder in our world because, gee, they've got a whole box full of toys. And that's okay. Just help them value them. And help them be generous with all the stuff they have. Rule 9, work hard. Important to teach your kids to work hard. And this is challenging. I grew up on a farm. So it's very easy for me to learn to work hard. That's one thing my parents did teach me. That's one thing I did have as a kid. I had a whole lot of mess up going on in my life, but I've been a hard worker since very early age. I can't remember what age I was when I started walking beans. We rented property from a farmer, and he had a lot of soybeans, and way back then, you needed to walk down the rows of these beans and pull and chop weeds out of them. And I wouldn't be exaggerating if I think I was second, third grade, and I was out there doing that. Hopefully I'm not. How old are you when you're second, third grade? Yeah. 8 or 9, 10 years old. I was out there working all day long in the summer sun. It was slave labor. I mean, someone could have been sent to jail, but no, it was very good for me. I learned to work hard at the very beginning. Now, growing up at a farm, that's all easier. I mean, imagine 100 years ago, you're growing up, you're raising your family on a farm. I mean, this is a no-brainer. Of course, those kids are going to be getting up early in the morning and doing chores and helping you with the farm stuff, This whole thing was easier 100 years ago. Now it's harder. And our kids are so pampered. Again, this is a little bit what I'm talking about, that whole, are our kids focused on performing for others or serving others? Are they focused on performing with their natural talents or serving people with their spiritual gifts from God? And this is a hard one in our culture. I live in suburbs of America, and there's only so many chores to do around the house. So we find ways. I prayed for a long time that I could find someone with a farm that my kids could serve at. And there's a family in our church that has a small farm, and they've got farm work to do, and my kids work out there every once in a while. And I've been very thankful for that exposure they have in that way. Working in the church, we try to find stuff for them to do. And that's one thing I would say about particularly my boys that I really appreciate about them, that when we have something for them to do, they get to it and they do it. I think the challenge for us as mom and dad sometimes is finding stuff for them to do. And that's one reason I started the Friday boys' time, is to get these kids out of the house. And again, I'm hoping to have more time to do service projects with those boys, especially as they get older, just so I'm helping these families to get their kids out there doing stuff. And in fact, for Mission to the City, I think I mentioned earlier, we're going to be painting a single mom's house. And that was something I originally wanted to do with the Friday night boys' time. But we got to find stuff for them to do, help them work hard. Obviously, schoolwork is part of that, working hard. That's a challenge. But God's commandment here is 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. There is that Sabbath there. We're supposed to rest, but the other half of that commandment is, look, I want you working. It's God's commandment. And so, another challenge there. Finally, we want our kids to count the cost and pay the price for my actions. This covers so many things. That they do understand, they grow up with understanding that there's consequences. Now, maybe the consequence is that you need to ask forgiveness here and fess up to what you did and change your mind about this, that you don't want to do this again. And but sometimes the consequences need to be more severe. And do our children accept discipline from us when there's consequences? This is very important. That they start understanding, yep, I did wrong. It's not you telling me wrong and they're fighting you on that. Like, you're crazy, I didn't do anything wrong there. You got a problem there now, okay? You haven't taught them right and wrong. You're trying to help them to admit, yep, I did wrong. And I want to make up for that. Either by asking forgiveness. Again, that can happen sometimes if they're humble. But if they're not being humble, then there's greater consequences. Proverbs 3, my child, do not reject the Lord's discipline and don't get angry when He corrects you. The Lord corrects those He loves just as parents correct the child they delight in. And there's an attitude problem there when our kids resent correction. When they do something wrong and they suffer consequences and they don't do it willingly, that's a problem too. They need to learn that God is trying to help them, that I'm trying to help them learn. And you can talk about, God disciplines me because He loves me. I'm disciplining you. This whole thing, count the cost and pay the price for my actions, starts very young with, young children just cleaning up after themselves. They say, well, can I get out the colors and play with my colors? Yep. But afterwards, you're going to count the cost and pay the price for playing with your colors. You're going to pick up those colors. And this is what we raise kids, to do all the time, is they want to just do all the fun stuff but not pay the price for the fun stuff. And you're the one that's picking up after them. They play with the toys, and you're the one that's picking up after them. That is not training them to count the cost and pay the price for my actions. Older children activities, they can't do it all. They're not. It's so hard for these kids. They think they can do it all. They don't count the cost and pay the price. They think, well, I can just do it all. No, they can't. You got to make choices here because you can't do everything. If they want to be in the children's music choir, have a pet, do a 4-H project, go to a movie, then you count the cost, pay the price. Can you really do all that? And sometimes our kids can feel so entitled, but they need to learn what we as adults have learned. There's a limit to our time and resources, and they got to learn that. Another way that we train our kids to count the cost and pay the price for the actions is to keep promises. If they make a promise, they keep it. And that's one thing we try to instill in our kids as well. Having kids pay for things with their own money, they have to make choices. My boys now, the money they earn is earned hard. Every little, they don't get paid $20 an hour for whatever work they do. And so, their money doesn't grow very fast. And so when they spend it, boy, they gotta decide carefully what they're going to spend it on. So having kids pay for things with their own money helps them count the cost and pay the price. This is, in fact, obviously why adults live beyond their means, don't they? They didn't learn this when they were a kid. Count the cost, pay the price for their actions. And finally, helping them to learn to be a finisher, not a quitter. To count the cost and pay the price for what they decide to do. Help them to be a finisher and not a quitter. All right. We'll take some questions if there are any. We're kind of focused here on this age group about 6 to 12, these preteens. The focus is training them, educating them, and enforcing these things. Any questions about anything I've said here? Can we get that mic on? I've got it on here. Handheld. There you go.
I think one of the things we've struggled with is all of these things that you're talking about. I'm thinking of them as something that you can do as a believer. So some of our children are not saved yet, but yet we are to teach them not to lie and honor their parents, but you're expecting that they can do this without the Spirit indwelling them.
Yes, they can. They can do these things. They can, even without the Spirit, I believe they can do these things. Now, it is more of a conformity thing. They're doing it because this is the culture of my family. This is just how you live. Their conscience has been trained. Even an unbeliever's conscience can be trained. And they won't do something because their conscience has been trained and the pain of guilt is too much to do that thing. Now, obviously, a kid getting saved gives them, a power that an unsaved kid doesn't have. And that becomes a lot more important as they get older. It's going to be much, much harder for a teen, for example, to do this just because, this is my family culture. If they don't have that inward power, it's going to get harder. But for littler kids, that culture controls them. They don't need as much inward thing. It's more simple for that little kid. If I do this, I get, spanked, or there's consequences, or my mom and dad are displeased and I want to please my mom and dad. So that does a lot of controlling in their life and gives them the motivation they need to do these rules. As they get older as teens, pleasing mom and dad isn't as important. They need something more than what those littler kids do. Does that answer your question?
So obviously they can't always obey. They're not going to because they are sinful. Even as believers, we're not going to. So do you take those opportunities to say, okay, you disobeyed, or to kind of point them to the cross when they do disobey?
Especially as they get older. You bet. Especially as they get older. Even for us, though, we had to have the law established in our life. Paul tells us that the law leads us to the Lord, right? The law leads us to the cross. And if you haven't established that, I have seen 2- and 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. I have public school teachers telling me that they're seeing kids with no conscience. They have no conscience about what's right or wrong. And so that's all I'm trying to say is our kids first need to gain a conscience about right and wrong before the cross will even make sense to them or be significant to them. So I'm not saying it's all grace, or I'm not saying it's all law with no grace. I'm saying, though, make sure there is law there so that grace even matters to them. But you bet you can point your kids. And their disobedience is a great opportunity to share the gospel with them. A great opportunity. Absolutely. Good question. Yes?
Hey, Kurt. My question to you was, in the previous session, you had talked about how we need to have a parent-centered home and not a child-centered home. But by the very nature of our discussions this morning, we're focusing on the children. And as I listen to it, I just hear, to accomplish these things, we would have a completely overwhelming child-centered existence. Could you address that? And is it an attitude issue? Is it or is it a pragmatic issue?
Yeah. Well, you guys have a lot of children, and so I can see what you're saying. We've raised 5 children, fairly closely in age, and so we understand where you're coming from. So it's not so much, when I say being a God-centered or a parent-centered family instead of a kid-centered family, it's not so much in what your time is being consumed with. It's more about your motives and the reasons that you're doing it. You better believe it. If your house is full of little kids, your time is going to seem very kid-centered, okay? But why are you doing that? A kid-centered mindset, a kid-centered motivation is, I want my kids to behave so that they don't embarrass me in public. I want my kids to behave because it makes my life easier. Those aren't the right centeredness. Those aren't the right motivations for our parenting. When I talk about God-centered parent, I'm talking about remembering, hey, this is not my kid ultimately. This is God's kid. And he's going to stand before God someday. And I need to raise him with God's values. So it's more in the terms of motivation, perspective, that I'm talking about God-centered life instead of a kid-centered life. But you better believe it, when you're neck deep in kids, your time is going to be kid-centered for sure. And that's just the season of life you're in. Brenda and I are getting out of that season of life. And in one sense, it's wonderful. And in one sense, I'm looking forward to grandkids. And but there's just different seasons in life. And my heart goes out to those moms, those stay-at-home moms who have kids neck deep. And I tell the story of we lived out in the country for a little while, and we were homeschooling our kids. And I was working out of my home as a pastor at that time. And I came downstairs once from my office, and there's Brenda. She's sitting at the kitchen table, and the 3 girls are surrounding her because she's doing homeschooling. The girls are sitting right here, right next to her, and she's doing homeschooling. She's instructing them. And the 2 twin boys are standing on the table, looking down, watching this whole thing. That's the picture I had. And, I should have been thinking, need to get those boys off the table. They're going to kill themselves. But I just thought, my goodness, what a sacrificial life. This mom sitting there and these kids are just, right around her, and she's teaching them, and she's laying her life down for them. And I was just speechless, that picture. And thank God that God gives moms grace to do that. I don't know if I could do that. I think there's something about being a mom. We've talked today about some special, unique things that dads bring to the table, but we can't forget about the special, unique things that mom brings to the table. I don't know if I could be surrounded by little kids all day long laying my life down for them. I might go insane. And so I know it's hard. And it feels like your life is kid-centered, because that's what your time is being consumed by. That's what your season of life is. But don't let your reason, don't let your motivation, your life perspective, the big picture be kid-centered. It's still about God. Still got to be about God. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Music has become a big likeness in my tween daughter. What rules or standards would you suggest regarding secular music?
Secular music. We have pretty high standards in that area, and we've struggled with that one a little bit. I don't know why. Our kids are really attracted to secular music. And they'll complain about the Christian music doesn't have the right beat to it, blah, blah, blah. But we've been pretty strong on that one because there's a message in that secular music. And now, I'm not this legalistic guy that says rock and roll is automatically sin. Okay, now there's guys out there writing stuff that says just even the beat of rock and roll is sinful. That's ridiculous. It's the lyrics, it's the words that can be good or bad, moral or immoral. It's not the beat. But we've been pretty hard on that one, not having secular music. And if we find it on the, one of the girls has driven the car and we find it's to one of those stations, they hear about it. And I'll just be honest with you, that's a concern I have in our church. I mean, we've got great kids, but I'm a little surprised at how much secular music they listen to. And it does concern me. And we draw a line there. I don't like secular music. Don't like it. Hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Our kids are getting to the older end of this age segment, and we're starting to struggle more with balancing activities. And I think part of where our question or struggle comes in is a lot of the ministries that we're involved in aren't ones that our kids can join us in. And so they're kind of sidelined in some of that. There's other ways that they can serve. But then kind of balancing that with having them be involved in activities, or whether it's service or other performance-based ones, as you would have called them earlier. How did you guys handle some of that balance?
Yeah, I'd change your ministry. I might consider changing what ministries you're in. Some of these ministries that maybe are something you can't do with your kid, maybe they need to wait until you're in a different season of life a little bit more. And I know it's, maybe that's hard, but boy, it's so important to find ministry with people or the church that you can involve your kids in. So I push life groups. That's why I'd love to see more parents involved in Awana, because I think it's a good way to serve with your kids, your older kids. Youth group, we want dads to come alongside of us and help us make youth group a service, outreach-oriented thing. So hopefully hopefully you can do both, to be honest with you. We've certainly tried to do both. We've been able to do both. But I certainly have tried to make sure that I'm doing a ministry. As I said, I've even started ministries for at least the initial reason, this is something I can do with my kids. They're at this age and I can do this with them, so I start a ministry. So you really need to prioritize that. And hopefully there's room for other type of ministry you can't do with your kids, but I'd say if push comes to shove, you make sure you got a ministry you can do with your family, as a family, with your kids, and maybe you have to give up something else. I certainly would if that was in that season of life. Good question. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm trying to narrow this down. It seems kind of broad, but when we're having a situation where our son he's not being respectful, and immediately he doesn't take responsibility for it, so it's almost like he doesn't have a conscience about it, but later on he will when he's not in the heat of it. And I'm wondering, do we need, and he's getting to the end of this age too, do we need to focus more on going back and training, or move on to the next stage? In other words, if you kind of fail in the earlier stage, do you need to go back and get them straight in that before you move on, or just kind of press on?
How old is your son again?
He's going to be 12 next week.
And do you think he has a personal relationship with Christ? I think he does.
I think he does.
Yeah. So here's the good news. Okay, I think your real son is coming out when later he says, "Man, that was wrong. I wish I wouldn't have done that." Your son is in Romans 7 with the Apostle Paul. Okay, the Apostle Paul, he's been a Christian for more than 20 years, and he still says, "Man, I'm doing stuff I don't want to do, and I still don't do stuff I want to do." And we're living that as Christians, and your son is living in that as well. And which is, again, that's why grace starts becoming so important. Paul is experiencing grace in Romans 7. He's saying, you know what? That's not even me that's doing that. I so hate sin. It's not even me that's doing that sin. That's sin living in me. You talk about having your identity in Christ. Paul was so radical, he said, you know what? I'm not sinning. It's sin in me. I mean, that can sound either really arrogant or really humble, one way or the other. And so remember that your son is in Romans 7, and he's a good boy. And he's struggling with those things. So what's happening there is the same thing that happens with us. There's things that happen that get him out of the Spirit. And that's why he's initially responding that way in anger, rebellion, whatever, because there's something getting him out of the Spirit. And so what you need to do is you need to sit him down and talk, not talk about, son, you were angry there, okay, and there needs to be discipline here. Because he's old enough now to sit him down and talk about, son, what's behind that anger? What's going on there? You and I both know you don't want to treat me that way. So what were you thinking? What was going through your mind when that was happening? What got you out of the Spirit in that instance right there? So you're trying to get behind the behavior to what they're believing and helping them change their mind there so they're more consistent living in the Spirit. So this stuff I talked about in the first session about having our identity in Christ and consistently walking in the Spirit starts becoming very important for these kids as they get older, so they can walk in the Spirit as well. Does that answer your question?
So immediately I should should I kind of look past the immediate not taking responsibility and being respectful, or should there be consequences or grace?
Yeah, I think immediately, you need to deal with it. There's consequences. You show your displeasure. That was wrong. And if they're not ready to hear it, if they're not ready to talk, you need to deal with what's happening right then and there. But follow it up later. And maybe you can follow it up 5 minutes later with, son, what was going on there? And because they're getting old enough that you can talk to them about those things. Again, when they're little and they're toddlers, you're not trying to talk about, 2-year-old, why did you sin there? Okay, you're not doing that. When they're 12, you can start talking about those types of things. Another question?
Yeah, my daughter's 7, and my question is, how do you encourage them, because obviously this is, she's at the early end of this stage you're talking about. How do you encourage them to move from actions based on consequences or rewards to doing it because it's the right thing or doing it because they care about others genuinely?
That's not something you really have to worry about. That's something that will happen naturally as they grow up. And the way it happens is, a 4-year-old isn't very much self-aware. A 4-year-old doesn't think a whole lot about their motives for doing something. As they get older, they start becoming more self-aware and more conscious of why I'm doing what I'm doing and that sort of thing. And so that transition from doing something just because of the consequences or doing something because this is what I really want to do and I've decided to do happens naturally as they get older and as they get mentally more mature. Any other questions, Pete?
I had a couple comments.
Good.
On the question of doing ministry with our kids, and I just had a couple ideas to pass along. I remember going to another pastor's house for dinner one time when I was on the road on a business trip, and this family chose that each kid, he had 4 kids, each kid was given the assignment to ask one question of the guest at the table. And so I was encouraged. It was a way of teaching your kids to be engaged in ministry. So it's not simply because some of our ministry is with other adults, but that was one way that, and their kids were in age like 3 to 10 or something like that, and each kid asked one question. Another idea is at church, a tendency for parents is when church is over, the kids kind of split, run for the donuts or go see a friend or something like that. Another idea is that my kids, I did this when they were younger, they weren't allowed just to go run and go play with their friends. They had to do one of 2 things. One, they had to stand with me as I talked to another adult. Or 2, I would find out who they wanted to spend time with, or I would direct who they would spend time with and get to know. New family in church, kid their age, I'm directing them to that family and meet the kid that is their age. I remember one time during church, I chose to have, I think it was Nate that was with me, and I met a new family at church that day. They were from Arizona. Nate started sharing his experiences when he was in Arizona, and so a young kid relating to the adult that I'm trying to minister to. Just another example that we've done as a family is Sunday night's been family night for us, and we did this more a while back, but we would take ice cream to someone in the church that's newer that we hadn't got to know very well yet. And so we had the kids...
Unannounced, by the way. He wouldn't announce himself, he'd just show up.
We would just show... Well, that's not totally true.
Oh, okay.
Not totally true, because that's where we got the kids involved. And they would write the invite from the family that didn't know that they were inviting us. And the kids would write it, and they'd get the envelope, and they'd address the envelope, and they'd... Jenna one time would even crumple. It looked like that had been sitting around for a while. She would try and crumple up the paper, and... Anyway, but we would just go and show up, and we'd say, hey, we got your invite, thanks for inviting us, and the invite says, hey, we'd love to have you for ice cream sometime, and if you want, you can bring the ice cream too. And but it's a way that the kids were doing ministry with us, with other adults. So just a few different ideas.
Great. I did give you a handout on spanking. We're going to cover that quite a bit in the next session, but you know, obviously 6 to 12, you're still in the range where you're doing some physical discipline, and you might want to stick around for the next session, because I'm going to talk more about that in the next session. I will tell you this, that as you're getting to the end of that age, 10, 11, 12, it shouldn't be happening as much. If you've been diligent in the previous years, now I'm talking generalities here. But for example, my 12-year-old boys, I can't remember the last time Brenda and I spanked our 12-year-old boys. I just can't even remember it. When has it been? Has it been more than a year? More than 2 years? Probably, maybe it's been 2 years since the last time we spanked our 12-year-olds. Now, when they were 6 years old, all right, it was multiple times every day, oftentimes. So, there's stages of life here, but you still that information on spanking there, and that may still be very valuable to you during these preteen years. And if you want to learn more about that, you can stick around for the next session. Okay. Lord, we thank you for our children. We thank you, God, that you're parenting with us. We are not alone in this, and that you give us grace. And you have not given us something that we can't do that's beyond our reach. Help us to live by the power of your Holy Spirit, that we have the love and the strength to raise these kids to be your kids. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm sorry, I wanted to mention these books again. If you're new to our conference, there's 2 books in particular on parenting that we are encouraging you with. $5 a piece. This black one and this one, Premeditated Parenting. There are lots of books out there, and I'm only recommending 2. These are great books, and they're worth having, and they're worth reading through, and they're $5, and we've got them available right up here. I don't know, you can just pay Brenda or put it in the offering tomorrow, that type of thing. There's a couple books there on motherhood as well that Brenda's really appreciated, and you can take a look at those. All right.